So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be loved. Love means understanding, redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be loved by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be loved by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be loved and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be loved and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be love and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be loved and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
Good morning. Welcome to our final Student with King Interactive Civil Rights Talk event for this school year. Today we are having a special program in honor of our founder, Mrs. Coretta Scott King's 95th birthday. Our guest today will share freely with each of you about this amazing human being. On behalf of Dr. Bernice A. King, our CEO of the King Center, and the Student with King staff, thanks for joining with us today, as well as throughout the school year for those who have been participating. We want to make sure this program is meeting your expectations. So I'm asking that you please complete our survey. Teachers, students, everyone, take out your phones now and scan the survey, the QR code now. It will appear on the screen shortly. Your support is truly, truly needed. The King Center is truly interested in helping develop our beloved community in every aspect. We understand the importance of your leaders, young leaders. So we are encouraging students to join us for our beloved Community Leadership Academy. Prior to our moderator appearing to start our program, you will have a short presentation on this awesome program. Following that presentation, you will be greeted by our moderator, Mr. George Franco, auctioneer and former reporter anchor for Fox 5 News, Atlanta. Finally, I want to ask you to please ask questions of our guests by using the chat box and join the beloved movement by taking the pledge. Let's get started with our special presentation.
The King Center's beloved Community Leadership Academy is excited about the opportunity to help students recognize and develop their potential to become nonviolent leaders in industries such as technology, innovation, business, and entrepreneurship. Our multi-year program is the first nonviolent youth incubator that enables youth to dream, build, innovate, and commercialize inventions that further Dr. King's living legacy. Applying Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence to the technology and innovation sphere, youth will design nonviolent mobile apps, vlogs, 3D CADs, digital games, and all other career design opportunities that creatively solve global issues. Students will challenge themselves to grow professionally and academically through our project-based learning model. Our academy utilizes a four-pronged model. 1. Learn. Students will be educated in the philosophy and methodology of Kingian nonviolence, what we call Nonviolence 365. 2. Ideate. Students will participate in an ideation lab where they apply their nonviolence knowledge to design innovations aimed at social change. 3. Build. Students will build their own nonviolent inventions, such as mobile apps, vlogs, 3D CADs, and digital games. 4. Pitch. Students will pitch their own business plan, company structure, patents, funding models, and work with business mentors to commercialize their nonviolence inventions. Students will have the opportunity to engage in networking opportunities with business professionals and representatives from the King Center, universities, Fortune 500 companies, and civic leaders who will empower today's youth with the skills to effectively implement Dr. King's philosophy and methodology of nonviolence, while also empowering them to define pathways to success in life. The beloved Community Leadership Academy is the premier youth program of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. The beloved Community Leadership Academy is committed to developing the next generation of compassionate, courageous, and conscientious nonviolent leaders to solve pressing world issues. For more information and to apply, please visit www.thekingcenter.org/Leadership Academy.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is George Franco, a former reporter and anchor at Fox 5 News here in Atlanta, now known as the Good News Auctioneer, raising money for funds for nonprofits, schools, and foundations. My extreme honor to be your moderator as we travel down an amazing road together. It's a road with historical markers along the way, a road where we will learn more about Mrs. Coretta Scott King, the widow of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and a historical figure in her own right. Welcome to the King Center's Interactive Civil Rights Talk, a special presentation on the life and work of Mrs. Coretta Scott King, founder of the King Center. At this time, it's time for you to comment and tell us where you are joining us from. That's why I say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are coming from. We have some people who we saw that were in Brazil, others in other parts of the world. You can join now and chime in and let us know where you're coming from. All right, I see Sundar Manuel. Good evening from India. There you go. Good evening from India, Mundal. Good morning from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Yes, thank you for joining us, Nicole Young. April Bell in Alpena, Mississippi, I believe that is, or Missouri, Michigan. Forgive me. And who else is joining us, and where are you coming from, and what brought you here? Good morning from the classroom prison from, good morning, Ty Bell. Pipeline from classroom to prison or from classroom to warehouse. Thank you. Hashtag system change. God bless you for saying that. Yes, indeed. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, my name is George Franco. I'm your Good News Auctioneer. We're traveling this path with a special guest today. It's an expert, really. She's an expert, Dr. Kelisha Graves. She's the Chief Research, Education, and Program Officer with the King Center in Atlanta. Her interest in Coretta Scott King began when Dr. Graves was just a teenager, maybe like some of you folks watching right now. She's carried her passion into a mission of shedding light, love, and education into helping the world discover more about Mrs. Coretta Scott King. We will speak with Dr. Graves in just a bit, but first, let's take a look at her video.
Welcome to our Students with King Nonviolent Spotlight Series. I'm Kelisha Graves, but my students call me Professor Graves. I'm a teacher, and I really enjoy helping students learn more about the life and impact of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott King is commonly known as the wife and widow of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But what I want you to know is that she was a woman of substance and commitment. Yes, that's right. Mrs. King was a leader and a world changer in her own right. Mrs. King was a leader, a wife, and a mother. She fought for freedom, and she inspired Dr. King to fight for freedom. And because of her, we have the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. She was also the driving force behind the National King holiday, which is celebrated every third Monday in January. Yes, you guessed it, Mrs. King was awesome. Coretta Scott was born on April 27, 1927, in Heiberger, Alabama, to Obadiah Scott and Bernice McMurray Scott. As a young person, she attended the Lincoln High School. Later, she attended Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, where she majored in music and elementary education. After leaving Antioch College, she attended the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, Massachusetts, where she majored in voice and violin. While studying at the New England Conservatory of Music, she met Martin Luther King Jr. Mrs. King and Dr. King had a common interest in social justice and activism. Together, they committed their lives to bring about peace and justice through nonviolent social change.
The world is in dire need of a spiritual awakening which will make those eternal values of love, justice, mercy, and peace meaningful in our time.
Mrs. King was not only important to the civil rights movement, of which she and her husband were central leaders, but she was also a leader in the global fight for social justice. Mrs. King believed in working for what she called the higher cause of service. This means that she believed people had a responsibility to fight for peace, justice, and equality. She believed that people could come together and achieve the beloved community through nonviolent resistance to repression and injustice around the nation and the world.
Nonviolence is the most powerful force that we have for the counteracting of hatred, bitterness, and violence which have infested our society.
Let me break it down for you. Our world is better because of Coretta Scott King. Throughout her life, Mrs. King was involved in a variety of causes, from the Montgomery bus boycott to the Charleston hospital workers movement. She participated in marches and nonviolent direct action campaigns. However, what many young people don't know is that one of Mrs. King's key contributions to the civil rights movement was through the performing arts. Yes, Mrs. King was a trained singer. And during the movement, she developed and performed what were called freedom concerts. The freedom concerts told the story of the civil rights movement through narrative and song. These events raised awareness about the experiences of African Americans in this country and raised money for the civil rights movement. In other words, Mrs. King stepped in when she realized that the civil rights movement needed her help. Will you step in when people need you? Mrs. King believed that young people had the power to change the world. She insisted that young people had a role to play in bringing about the beloved community. She wanted to empower young people to know that you can make a difference. She said,
Today's student is now recognized as a significant political actor with amazing power to influence the course of societies all over the world. In many ways, American students have now, with all their innocence and open generosity, become the prodding conscience to those in power and those aspiring to it.
I hope that each of you were able to learn something new about Mrs. Coretta Scott King and her impact. But the greatest lesson I want you to capture from her life is this: you are never too young to make change. Always remember that your life has meaning and purpose. You have a place in this world. One of her favorite quotes was by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and it says, "Lives of great men all remind us that we can make our lives sublime and departing leave footprints upon the sands of time. In other words, you can make a difference because your voice matters. I want to leave you with this challenge. Each of us has a personal responsibility to help create a more just, humane, equitable, and peaceful world. Following Mrs. King's example, how do you plan to make a difference in the world? And finally, always remember to be love.
So these young people are being prepared differently than I was because they live in a different time. But the most important thing they have to decide is not just to get an education and to be selfish about it, but that they must prepare themselves to give back and to make a difference in the world. We have to create what my husband called the beloved community. If we are to survive, we have to learn how to solve our problems and resolve our conflicts in a nonviolent manner. And so I think it's important for them to realize that they have a personal responsibility, each one of them.
If you would like to learn more, please check out our website at thekingcenter.org.
Day. We're going to take questions from the folks around the world who are watching us right now, but let's start with this. You told me that you had an interest in Coretta Scott King as a teenager. Now, where did that come from and how did you pursue it?
Thank you so much for that question. So yes, correct. I was actually 15 years old when I first became interested in the life of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. And it actually happened in an interesting way. I wasn't planning. It was not on my list of things to do for that day. But I remember, this is the official story. I was sitting in my room and I was working on a schedule or a list or something. I've always been a person who has loved history. And so what I was working on at that point was like a list of all of the old movies I was going to watch. Literally, that's what I was doing in my room, right? All the movies from the 40s and the 50s. And my dad was in the other room and he said, "Hey, come in here and watch this television, this news program." And I was kind of reluctant. Now, this was in January 2006. This was early January. So in the first couple of weeks of January around the King holiday. And of course, during King holiday, everybody in the world is talking about Dr. King and, showing his speeches and his clips from marches and all of that. My dad said, "Come in here and watch this program." And the program was called Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. And I was reluctant to go because at that time, like, most young people in the United States, we learned about Dr. King, during the King holiday. And so I was kind of like, well, I already know about Dr. King. What else is there to know? So I reluctantly went. I was watching the news program and they were playing clips of the Selma to Montgomery March and Dr. King and Mrs. King were marching. And I immediately was struck. I was like, if Coretta Scott King was there, why didn't I know that? Right? I knew about Dr. King, but I was like, if Mrs. King was there, why didn't I know that? Why didn't anybody tell me? And when I was teaching, I would tell my students, all good research starts with a good question. And so my question was, who was Coretta Scott King and how could I learn more about her? And so I went immediately after that program was over to my parents had an office in our home and got on the computer and, was on Internet Explorer at the time. And I started trying to find information about Mrs. King on the internet. Now, again, this is early January 2006. Mrs. King would pass January 30th, 2006. So this is several weeks before she passed. And I was disappointed at the fact that there wasn't a lot of information on the internet. And so I went to my local library and tried to find books about Mrs. King. And all I was able to find were, a few children's books. And I read those, but I was still dissatisfied. And as a matter of fact, I had a running bill with my local library because I would check out books and never return them, right? And I would put them on my shelf like they were mine. I don't advise anybody to do that, but I
You were
did have a
learning.
running bill. Right. So I had a running bill, but so I was still dissatisfied with the lack of information, and so I said at 15 years old, I said, I want to be the person who does a definitive work on Mrs. King. I want to be an expert on Coretta Scott King and tell the world about her, because literally, although I never met Mrs. King in person, her influence literally changed the course of my life. The reason why I became a teacher, the reason why I went into education was precisely because at 15, I said, I want to tell the world about Coretta Scott King. And the only way I can do that and people actually listen to me is if I become a teacher, right? Because if I'm a teacher, people have to listen to me at that point. So that's why I ended up going the route of education. But that's really how it started. And then shortly thereafter, Mrs. King passed January 30th, 2006, as I mentioned. And a couple of weeks after that, I ended up writing a letter to Mrs. King's oldest child, Yolanda King. And so I wrote the letter in about February 2006, and I sent it to her office in California. And in that letter, I just talked about, the impact that her mother had on my life and how I wanted to become a teacher and, do a definitive work on her mother. And also I put my phone number in the letter, right? I remember distinctly when I got down to, because I typed it also, I typed the letter on the computer. And I remember when I got down to the sincerely Kelisha Graves, I was like, I'm gonna put my phone number on here. And so I sent it off to her office in California, and that was it. And then I prayed, right? I said, Lord, please let Miss King get my letter. And that was it. Went to school, a couple of weeks went by, and we got a call to that number that I put in the letter from one of Miss King's assistants who worked with her in California. And she said, Miss King received my mother answered the phone, and I was at school. So I was like in the 9th or the 10th grade. And I was at school, and my mom got the phone call, and she said, Miss King received Kelisha's letter. It touched her heart, and she wants to know if you all can be in Atlanta this weekend. And so this was a Wednesday. I remember the day. It was a Wednesday when we got the call. And of course, who's going to say no to that, right? And so we met Miss Yolanda King at the King Center on a Saturday in Atlanta, and it was just absolutely marvelous. It changed my life being able to meet, one of Dr. King's children. And so really that's how everything started. That's how my trajectory even now has started. So that was a long time ago, right? That was like 16
Not that long ago.
Right. Right. So, about 16 years ago or so.
Yeah.
But after that point, I literally just stuck with it and continued my research. Mr. Franco, it's interesting because I was cold calling people for interviews. I remember I was on the computer, going to 411.com trying to find people's phone numbers. Because I read all of the books, on Dr. King, and I was getting people's names, and, I was looking for contact information and doing interviews with folks who participated in the civil rights movement, with, people who knew Dr. King and Mrs. King personally. So I was on a mission, and I'm so happy that even at that young age, and this is important for young people to know, that despite your age, if your mind is committed to a purpose, people will take you seriously.
Right.
And I am so grateful that even in my engagement with the King Center at that young age, people took me serious. And so even now, in working at the King Center, in my role, I have an opportunity to work with so many of the people who knew me, right, when I was 15 years old. And so that long story, but that's the official narrative on that.
Well, you were on this path, and you saw the mission, and you followed the mission, and you got to that place where you are now. Let's remind the young people and everybody watching, students and teachers, have you put your questions for Dr. Graves in the chat bar? So we are going across the world right now, and we're asking people to reflect on Dr. King, as well as Coretta Scott King. Obviously, we're acknowledging her. So, but I've got a couple more questions until we keep waiting. I have to tell you, I'm a little bit older than you because I remember when Dr. King was assassinated. I was a young child. And so my parents cried, and that fit right about the same level of national trauma that happened when President Kennedy was assassinated. My mother cried as a very young child when that happened. So yes, I remember, and I interviewed the great farm worker leader Cesar Chavez. So I have had some interaction with that. I never did meet, obviously, Dr. King, but I did see Coretta Scott King when I came to Atlanta as a reporter, and I covered her services when she passed. So yes, there is history along the way. So let's talk a little bit about that, because people see Dr. King and Coretta Scott King as historical figures. And in that sense, how did Mrs. Coretta Scott King assist with the nonviolence movement?
All right, that's a great question. There are a couple of ways I want to answer that. First of all, in her personal life, not only in her public life, Mrs. King was a practitioner of nonviolence. And so really what that means is that she lived her life in such a way, and the students will understand that she did not seek to create harm, right? She wanted to have a loving and peaceful existence. And so Mrs. King was a practitioner of nonviolence in her personal life as well as in her public life. It's interesting because during the movement, I don't know if people really see it this way, but one of Mrs. King's greatest contributions was even in her counsel, how she counseled Dr. King, right? Because again, they were partners in the movement. And so during the civil rights movement, Mrs. King, of course, participated in the various demonstrations and campaigns. But also one of her greatest contributions to the movement is in how she was able to offer counsel and encouragement to Dr. King. So that's one way to answer it. One of the most important ways that Mrs. King contributed to nonviolence is in her institutionalization of nonviolence and her creation of the King Center. I would dare say that Mrs. King was one of the first people immediately after the assassination of Dr. King to understand that nonviolence needed to be institutionalized in the form of a living memorial. Of course, during the civil rights movement, they did do trainings in nonviolence, et cetera. But immediately after Dr. King's assassination, I would dare say that Mrs. King was one of the first people to understand that nonviolence needed a home, right, to live in terms of an institution, right, but also that to build an educational framework around it, to understand that nonviolence needed to be a subject. Dr. King said this himself, a subject of study, right? And so Mrs. King did that through the King Center. And so her greatest contribution, right, is the reason why we're alive now, because the King Center still exists and is doing the work to promote nonviolence. And so Mrs. King's greatest contribution to nonviolence was the institutionalization through the King Center.
And the King Center is a wonderful place. And if you've ever been to Atlanta, please stop and visit. It is worth the visit. I understand, Dr. Graves, that we've got a question from the audience. So let's see what's going on. April Mueller-Bell says, I have 4 kids, 3 are 13, 1 is 17. I'm looking to supplement their public school online. What would be the best way to incorporate this curriculum? I have used PBS Learning Media for civil rights, different learning videos. 2 of my kids just asked me what the curriculum is. I told them that it's my job to give them all of the tools they need to be the generation that can be part of the change this world needs. Amen. What words would be best to open the conversation on introducing this? Okay, what do you think?
Sure. So in terms of curriculum, one of our main areas of focus at the King Center is to continue to produce learning content. So my role at the King Center, so the audience is aware, I serve as the Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer. And so what that means essentially is that I have the opportunity to work with a great group, a great team of people, where our job is literally to think about and to create learning experiences for people all over the world. And so I would encourage, specifically as it relates to Mrs. King and Dr. King, please do visit the King Center's website at thekingcenter.org/classroom resources, where you will be able to access a plethora of material that can help support learning around, Mrs. King, Dr. King, and the civil rights movement. And so I would encourage all of the audience members to start at the King Center's website, and please do see our classroom resources.
And Dr. Graves, I'm fascinated by your research, your commitment, and your stick-to-itiveness in learning more about Mrs. Coretta Scott King. A couple of questions come out of that. Do you think she had the dream, or did you know her dreams as a young person? And did she plan to be a civil rights leader? And I still got to follow this up, because I was a little surprised that I didn't know that she was quite the songbird.
Yes, indeed. So there's a couple of questions there. Mrs. King did not necessarily plan to be a civil rights leader. What she knew as a young person is that she wanted to use her life to make an impact, right? She wanted to use her life to make an impact because she observed all of the things that were going on around her. And she knew, even as a young person, that she wanted to make the world a better place than the one that she inherited. Okay, so Mrs. King knew as a young person that she wanted to use her life to make an impact. Now, in terms of a potential career trajectory, she thought that would be in the realm of music, right? The performing arts. A lot of people don't know that Mrs. King was a musician, played several instruments, right? When she's at the Lincoln School, one of her instructors teaches her how to play the horn, right? You've probably seen the photos online of Mrs. King with her children around her at the piano. So she was a musician at her core, but she also understood that she wanted to use her life to make an impact. That shifted when she met Dr. King. So they meet when they're in college, and so Dr. King, actually changes the trajectory of her life. He doesn't change nothing about the core mission, right? Again, she wants to use her life to make impact. None of that changes, just the direction that she originally thought she was going to go change. What a lot of people probably don't know is that at one point, Mrs. King thought about establishing a music settlement education or music settlement school for young people, because she was that committed to music. But also, she has a background in education. When she was at Antioch College, she studies elementary education and did some teaching as well. And then when she's at the New England Conservatory, she's also was in a music education program. And so she saw in her life a natural marriage between, the power of the performing arts and education. This is why during the civil rights movement, one of her greatest contributions is in the form of freedom concerts, right? And the freedom concerts were a set of events that was really inspired by Paul Robeson and other historical African-American performers during the mid 20th century. When she's, a young person, she's exposed to Paul Robeson. And one of the people she admires is Marian Anderson, who was a singer. And so she saw a natural relationship between using the performing arts as a foundation for education. So I don't know. And there was another part to that question. So what was the first part?
No, you answered it. I was talking about her proclivity toward music, her love of music, and how they combine together. We've got another question from the audience. Daniel Yount, I hope I pronounced that right, asked, did Coretta and Martin work together on any of his literal works?
On any of his literal works? That's interesting. So I'll tell this story. When they were in college, of course, everybody knows Dr. King received his doctorate, but Mrs. King was instrumental in that process as well, whether it came to, helping to type up, some of the manuscript or what have you. But Mrs. King, I want to answer that question this way. Mrs. King was a true intellectual partner with Dr. King. So as I mentioned earlier, when it came to the counsel that Mrs. King was able to offer Dr. King, or even prodding him in certain directions when it came to the peace movement, etc. So I want to answer that question in terms of want people to understand that Mrs. King was a true intellectual partner with Dr. King, and I think you can see that as well when you see a lot of her interviews. It's interesting because in Mrs. King interviews, she almost defaults automatically to talking about Dr. King because they were so intertwined in that way in terms of being intellectual partners. So that was a great question.
If you go back and look at historical photos, the Selma March, what was happening with the marches and the bus boycott, the freedom speech at the Square of Washington, every time Dr. King was in a historical place that made history, she was right there. And so, yes, he is the voice that everybody knows. But tell us about her influence, I suppose, on him and how you think that shaped what has become history now.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, I think Mrs. King was able to give counsel to Dr. King when it came to certain issues that were important, right? So in terms of peace, speaking out against the war in Vietnam, Mrs. King is a key voice who's prodding Dr. King, saying, you have to talk about this, right? This is something that we need to focus on. And so again, Mrs. King is a key intellectual partner in terms of shaping Dr. King's trajectory and on certain issues.
And he is assassinated, 1968 in Memphis. And no doubt a terrible, trying time for this family. But yet she has enough fortitude and wherewithal to understand that the mission was not complete. Even though he was extinguished, his mission, his message continued through what is now the King Center. And tell me about her driving force to make sure that mission didn't die with him.
Right. That's a great question. The reason why the mission didn't die with Dr. King is because the mission did not start there. It didn't start with Dr. King. When Dr. King and Mrs. King came together, the vision that was in both of them was amplified, right? Mm-hmm. Mrs. King was an activist. She had ideas. She was a thinker before she met Dr. King. So even when you look at, and I would encourage all of you out there to read Mrs. King's autobiography. There are two, My Life with Martin Luther King Jr., and then also My Life, My Love, My Legacy. So I would encourage the folks out there to read both of Mrs. King's autobiographies. But she was an activist before she met Dr. King. Even as a student, there was an episode at Antioch College where she was attending in the 1940s, where she had to do some teaching, and she was denied the opportunity to teach at one of the public schools there. And so one of her friends encouraged her to speak up against it, and she felt the natural urge to speak up against it. And although she was, denied that opportunity, it shows the activist spirit that was already there in her. She was, participated in progressive party politics, if you will. And so Mrs. King was committed before she met Dr. King. And as a matter of fact, when she met Dr. King, that's one of the things that he was impressed with. Their first meeting, he said, you have character, intelligence, beauty. There were four things that he mentioned. And so he was drawn to the fact that she was a thinker, that she had ideas, but not only that, but that she had a sense of mission as well. And so when Dr. King and Mrs. King came together, the mission that was already in them was amplified. And so they were able to soar.
And that's why that mission has continued, no doubt. And thank you for what you are doing. We've got a couple more things from the audience, apparently a question and a statement. Let's see. Caldwell says, what was the most interesting, quote, little known fact to you that you discovered in your research on Mrs. King that reveals her deep sense of humanity that made you go, wow, didn't know that?
That's a good question. So many. It's a good question. I think Mrs. King's, or I'll say it this way. I think about things a little differently. In looking at Mrs. King's history, I was really inspired by the entrepreneurial spirit that she had. And I don't know if people always think about Mrs. King in terms of being an entrepreneur, right? A lot of times the names or the monikers that we associate with Mrs. King are widow of, the wife of, etc. Mm-hmm. But in looking at the sum total of Mrs. King's life, I'm like, wow, this woman is a thinker, but she's also an entrepreneur. I mean, she established an institution that provided jobs for people, right? So I think I don't know if it's a little known fact, but a way that I think we should start to think about Mrs. King, Dr. Bernice A. King says this often about her mother being the architect of the King legacy, and that is absolutely true. But seeing Mrs. King in terms of her entrepreneurial spirit, her vision, and her foresight. For instance, Dr. King's one of his first public speech during the Montgomery bus boycott at the Holt Street Baptist Church, Mrs. King understood that was something that needed to be captured, right? Needed to be recorded. And so she had the foresight to know that this moment is going to be historical, it's going to be monumental, and it needs to be captured. So there are little things like that always inspire me about Mrs. King. Her amazing foresight, her amazing insight, and then of course her entrepreneurial spirit and her vision for the fact that she knew that an institution needed to be established that focused on, research, education, and training is remarkable. But I think it also reflects, again, remember when she's in school, she has this interest in elementary education, music education, etc. And so I kind of look at the sum total of Mrs. King's life and, try to offer some very different ways that we can think about her outside of the context of, simply being the widow of or the wife of.
The carrier of his message as well. We have Anna Paula saying perhaps it's too personal a question, but I always thought about the giant love inside their beautiful and strong family and how they dealt with those contexts. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for that comment. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to leave us with as we wrap up this look at as we wrap up this look at Mrs. Coretta Scott King? What would you like to say that you want other people to remember her by?
Yeah, I'll answer it this way. When I was teaching, I would ask my students at the beginning of every semester, when you think about African descended people in history, what comes to mind? And inevitably, we get the routine responses: slavery, Jim Crow, all of what might taken to be the hard experiences within the Black experience. And so we usually create a word cloud, put this on the board. And I said, what is the one word that we don't see on this board when we describe who African Americans have been in history? And they're like, I don't know, we've said everything. And I said, the one word that we don't say is thinker. Part of my mission is to help people to understand the breadth, the depth, and the width of the mind of Coretta Scott King. And that's borne out in her life and the causes that she committed herself to in the institutions that she established and the institutions to which she contributed her brain power toward. And so I want us to understand that Mrs. King was a thinker. right? She had intellect, she had ideas, she had vision, and that when she came with when she and Dr. King came together, that vision was amplified. She had a mission already, and I think that's important. Even if she didn't know that she would, ultimately go the route of becoming a civil rights activist, a human rights activist, a peace advocate, her core mission, she knew that she wanted to use her life for impact. And I think that's so important for young people to understand, that their lives have impact, that it's not the context of one's life that determines who and what you can be. It's the measure of your life that you define. And that's what you see in Mrs. King's life, despite the context of her early upbringing, where she witnesses, violence in her family, experienced racism and all kinds of injustices, right? She didn't allow that context to negatively impact her future. In fact, she used that context to push her forward. Mrs. King defined the measure of her life. She defined what she wanted her impact to be. And so I want young people to know that despite the context, right, doesn't matter. You have the power to define who you want to be in this world, right? Your jobs may change throughout your life, career trajectories or what have you. But if you have a sense of what your mission is, that's what will carry you through. I remember I used to tell my students, sometimes they would get kind of anxious about having to declare their majors. And I would say, okay, everybody chill out, right? Let's start with this first premise. Let's start with this first. Your first responsibility is to declare what your mission is, right? Because it's your mission that's going to carry you throughout your life. Even if your job changes, you go from one career to the next, that sense of mission is what will carry you. And Mrs. King's, throughout her life, that core mission didn't change. That sense of wanting to be to humanity. She was inspired by a quote by Horace Mann that said, be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity. It's one of the quotes that she lived by, right? That she wanted to use her life to impact humanity. I mentioned in the video, she was inspired by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who said, lives of great men all remind us that we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave footprints upon the sands of time. Meaning that we all have the capacity to make an impact. You don't have to attempt to change the world, but if you can just impact your world, your surroundings, it starts with you. It starts with me. And that's what Mrs. King understood intimately. That change began with her. So even in her early life, when there are all kinds of injustices that she witnesses, she knew that she wanted to use her life for good. And she demonstrated that. And it's powerful, Mr. Franco, because I have the honor of working with people at the King Center who knew Mrs. King personally. And even the stories that they tell, it's amazing, because what I hear from that is the personal impact that she had on people's lives. It wasn't just about what she did, but how she made people feel, right? The feeling that she was able to create in people, to help them know that they are a part of a greater tradition, that they are a part of creating and crafting the future together. So I know that was a long way to answer that question, but I think for the young people out there, Mrs. King's life can be a template, right, for the impact that we can make in our own lives. It's not about duplicating the achievements of someone else, right? But it's about using that as a foundation, as an inspiration for my own life. That's what happened with me when I was 15 years old. I was going in, totally different direction. I think I told you before when we spoke before this, I wanted to be a film historian, right? I remember for career day at school, we had to dress up as what we wanted to be. And I went as a film historian. So I dressed up and people are like, what are you? I'm a film historian, right? But when I was, introduced to Mrs. King's life and legacy, that literally shifted the trajectory of my life. And I said, you know what? I'm going to commit my life to sharing the good news about Mrs. King. And even in studying Mrs. King, it opened my mind up to being able to learn about other underrepresented figures in African American history. And so for all of the young people out there, Mrs. King's life should be a template for what's possible.
And thank you for your passion and your purpose. We want to thank Dr. Kelisha Graves, the Chief Research Education and Program Officer with the King Center, for leading us in a special presentation of the life and work of Mrs. Coretta Scott King, the founder of the King Center. I'm George Franco. It's been my honor to be your moderator. Remember, be the love, everybody, and make it a great day. Let's go to this video now.
Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the world when he demonstrated what could be achieved through nonviolence. Now, you can learn how to live and practice this philosophy yourself through Nonviolence 365 Online, an innovative digital experience developed by the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Nonviolence 365 Online features extensive video interviews with real nonviolence practitioners, including the King Center CEO Dr. Bernice A. King, King Center certified instructors and trainers, and veterans of the civil rights movement. Explorations of the historic campaigns that helped Dr. King forge his philosophy. Immersive, annotated reading experiences that enhance Dr. King's most influential writings on nonviolence. Custom activities, including quizzes and interactive scenarios to help you practice along the way. Real-world exercises to help you start applying nonviolence in your daily life. Nonviolence 365 is a love-centered way of thinking, speaking, engaging, and acting that leads to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. It isn't just a concept for philosophers or political leaders. Nonviolence 365 is a powerful, practical approach to dealing with conflict and dismantling injustice. Whether it's in your personal life, in your school or workplace, your local community, or a national movement. Dr. King, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and many others sought to create the beloved community, a society built on global cooperation and equity. This wasn't a lofty utopian dream. It's a realistic and achievable goal because each and every one of us has the power to make it happen by committing to nonviolence as a way of life. Take the first step today with Nonviolence 365 Online.
Wow, what a great conversation that we just witnessed. It was truly, truly from love that we had this conversation. And I just want to say to each of you, thanks for coming today. And I hope and I trust that you were as inspired by this conversation as Dr. Graves was inspired to learn more about Ms. Coretta Scott King. This was an excellent presentation and your questions were excellent. Now, let's take this opportunity to thank our moderator. Thank you for participating today, Mr. George. And also, I'd like to thank Dr. Graves for sharing with the passion and the love and the knowledge that she shared with us today. I'd like to also remind you to make sure you take the pledge. Be loved. Take the pledge. Also, teachers, remember to to answer the survey. We want to make sure this is a program that can benefit you and your students. So please give us feedback. And also check out our new self-paced NV365 experience. It is awesome. I'm currently going through it myself, and I highly encourage you, for educators, for teachers, for principals, for everybody. You will find it a life-changing event, and it can help you with the things that you are doing with your students. Finally, help your students sign up for the Beloved Leadership Academy. But for the students, there are scholarships available. You don't have to pay anything. So please join that event. It's an excellent program for leadership development, and they can come back and utilize what they learned in your school. So once again, thank you. What a way to end the school year. I wish you all the very best for the end of your school year, and I look forward to working with you next year. Thanks.